everyone, and welcome to our forum today. My name is Chanel van der Merwe. Today we are hosting Dr. Teresa McCarty, who will be giving a talk titled Indigenous-Language Immersion and Holistic Wellbeing, Insight from Native American Communities and Schools. And I now have the honor of introducing Dr. McCarty to you. Teresa McCarty lives and works in the homelands of the Gabrielino Tongva and respects the sovereignty of the Tongva people in this place. At the University of California, Los Angeles, she's a distinguished professor, the G.F. Naylor Chair in Education and Anthropology, and faculty in American Indian Studies. Her research centers Indigenous education, language planning and policy, and critical collaborative educational ethnography. She is a 2021 to 2022 CSBS Fellow at Stanford University and Principal Investigator on the Spencer Foundation-funded Indigenous-Language Immersion and Native American Student Achievement Study. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. McCarty. The floor is yours.
Good morning from this place that I am speaking from. Good afternoon, good evening. It's just wonderful to look into the screen and see so many names and faces, some of whom I know and some of whom I look forward to knowing better. And thank you, Chanel, for that very kind introduction. I want to give special thanks to Dr. McCarty for the invitation to participate in this virtual forum, and to Joey Verfai and Magdalena Madani Sa for the incredible support. Appreciate you helping with my PowerPoint, Magdalena. And Dr. Gomez, I understand you'll be moderating. Thank you for that. Thank you all for being here, and it's an honor to be part of this forum. So yes, thank you. We can put up the PowerPoint. Great. So today I want to share some emerging insights, preliminary themes from a US-wide mixed method multi-university study of Indigenous language immersion schooling, in which I and my colleagues, who I'll introduce in a moment, are currently engaged. And we can move to the next slide. But let me begin at the beginning. I'm currently speaking from the homelands of the Ohlone people who've cared for these lands and waterways for millennia and who are still here. And I recognize and respect their sovereignty over this place, known in English and Spanish as the San Francisco Bay Area. I also want to recognize the Gabrielino Tongva, on whose lands I live and work in my regular faculty position at UCLA, and which UCLA occupies. In this hemisphere, we are all carrying out our lives on native ground. I also believe it's important to acknowledge where our knowledge comes from. So I'm a non-native woman of Irish settler descent. And what I share with you today grows out of my work over many years as an invited collaborator, ethnographer, witness, and ally with Indigenous educators, communities, and schools that are seeking to implement an equitable, uplifting, culturally and linguistically responsible education for their children. Next slide. So the current continuation of this work is a US-wide study of Indigenous language immersion schooling, ILI, we call it for short. This is our overriding question. What can we learn to ensure educational and linguistic equity for Indigenous children, their families, and communities, and improve education practice and policy for Native American and other minoritized learners? The study is very generously funded by the Spencer Foundation of Chicago, Illinois, and I want to recognize that, that support. Next slide. These are the members of our study team: the Lakota scholar Tiffany Lee at University of New Mexico, and myself, Dr. Sheila Nicholas, a Hopi scholar at the University of Arizona, and my colleague at UCLA, Michael Seltzer. And we've been blessed with many wonderful, brilliant graduate assistants, and Kyle Holly Irby, Thomas Jacobson, and James McKenzie are currently members of our team. So what I'll be discussing today is not my work, but it's our collective work in collaboration with our partner schools. Next slide. ILI, as I'm sure all of you who are tuning in are know, it's similar to other types of language immersion, but it does differ in critical ways. ILI is an innovative approach in which 50 to 100% of instruction takes place in the Indigenous language. In all cases, children's second, sometimes more than second language, and often the second language of their teachers, and always a language that is endangered by coloniality. ILI includes a strong culture-based curriculum, and it grows out of two enduring problems. First, ILI can be seen as a proactive community-based response to the legacy of settler colonialism, and in particular, what my colleague Chanina Lomawam and I call erase and replace colonial schooling. And second, it's a proactive response to enduring education disparities that are the result of failed state-sponsored schooling. But ILI is not just an instructional approach, and that's the main theme I will make in my talk today. It's the enactment of sovereignty. It's a decolonizing move toward language and culture continuance and healing, what Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls remembering from colonial violence. While this is a promising practice that has been around for close to 40 years now, there's been no systematic US-wide study of its key features, potential benefits, and effects across diverse contexts. So that's where our study comes in, and we can go to the next slide. These are our research questions. What is the current state of ILI in the US? How, when, for whom, and why is it beneficial? And how do opportunities to learn and outcomes compare for students, carefully matched students in ILI and non-immersion programs and approaches? Answering these questions offers a needed contribution to research, but equally we aim to support Indigenous communities in strengthening their self-determined language education efforts and to inform policy and practice for Indigenous and minoritized students. Next slide. So these questions map on to 3 study components to understand the current state of ILI programs. We're conducting a national survey. That's the green box at the top. To learn how, when, for whom, and why ILI is beneficial, we're conducting in-depth case studies at 8 ILI schools that span from Hawaii to New York, different language communities. That's the red box. And that's basically what I'll be speaking about today. And to understand how ILI compares with non-ILI approaches, we're examining opportunities to learn and outcomes for carefully matched students in ILI and non-immersion programs. That's the purple box. Just a brief scan of our methodology. We've conducted 32 site visits to the 8 partner schools, working closely with educators and community members to ensure that our research methods are in sync with local values and norms. We've conducted dozens of classroom observations, probably more than 100 observations, in-depth interviews with 127 teachers, school leaders, parents, elders, youth, and we've collected extensive photographic, video, and archival data. So I'll be happy to talk about our methodology further in the QA. Let me just pause and say that in this research journey, we have been privileged to meet hundreds of amazing teachers, school leaders, parents, grandparents, and youth. You'll hear some of their voices in this brief talk. And we've witnessed incredibly inspiring education practices. Also witnessed the challenges they face, diminishing numbers of speakers, excuse me, inadequate and inequitable funding, and the constant need to develop curricula, ever-present English supremacy and colonialism. So I'm going to share a glimpse into this work today. And behind every word that I speak is the breath of those who are making and living this language and culture reclamation movement. Although I won't use actual names of participants or schools in the presentation, I acknowledge and thank them, and I'll try to do justice to their work. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So in this study, we've developed a profound appreciation for the holistic character of these language and culture efforts, qualities that go beyond the word achievement in our study title. So we use the term academic well-being to foreground these holistic qualities. In this time of pandemic unwellness, physical unwellness, but also systemic, social, racial, economic, and political unwellness. This holistic relational approach, we believe, has much to teach us all. I'm going to present what we're learning in a storied fashion as it has been gifted to us through a series of vignettes. Each vignette is contextualized with visual images of the local environment and place. I want to emphasize that this is a work in progress interrupted by what was to be the 5th and final year last year by a global pandemic. So what I share with you today are emerging insights from the qualitative portion of the study. And I'm drawing especially from an article our team just published in the Journal of Language Identity and Education, which I believe has Professor McCarty and his team have made available. It's part of a special issue on Indigenous knowledge edited by Drs. Prem Fayak and Peter DaCosta. So please sit back, relax, and activate your qualitative ethnographic imaginations. As you hear these accounts, listen for holistic pedagogical goals and practices. Listen for themes of relationality, mutuality, individual and community assets, community building, and well-being. Okay, so we will go to the first vignette. So the first vignette is described in the JLIE article I just mentioned, and I'll just kind of read to you from the ethnographic record. On a bright October day, Sheila, Tiffany, and I sat in the office of Sarah, a pseudonym, the administrator of a small ILI school in the northeastern US. We asked Sarah and her colleague Ellen, an esteemed community member, what had transpired since our last visit to their school at the end of the prior year. Ellen described the receiving and releasing ceremony that takes place at the beginning and end of each school year. The receiving ceremony occurs on the first day of school when teachers receive their students from parents. At this time, the parent describes their child's gifts to the teacher. On the last day of each school year, the teacher releases the child back to the parent, explaining what they did with the child's gifts and suggesting how those gifts might contribute to the community. For example, Ellen said, if they like to sing, maybe they can be a ceremonial singer. This is part of citizenship education, she added. It's building our Indigenous nation. Well, we could interpret this as a form of assessment, but more than a narrow assessment of children's academic progress, receiving and releasing are expressions of relationality and relational accountability. In effect, the parent has entrusted the child's gifts to the teacher for nearly a year in that child's life. In receiving and releasing the child from and to the parent, the teacher takes responsibility for that relational trust. And beyond this, Ellen referenced wider Indigenous nation building goals. As a teacher at another ILI school told us, we're not just teaching, we're raising a nation in our mother language. So we can go to the next slide. And this vignette will take us 5,000 miles west to the Hawaiian Islands, where 4 of our partner schools are located. So in this vignette, it was November 2018, and Sheila Nicholas and I were conducting our 3rd site visit to one of those 4 schools. There we met Moana and Kalani, again pseudonyms, and they were, Moana is an English teacher and Kalani is a math teacher. And they, of course, teach their subjects through Hawaiian. So we sat down across the table from them and listened as the teachers shared their personal language and culture stories and their aspirations for their students. Moana grew up in a rural area, and although her grandparents spoke fluent Hawaiian, she said her first language was Hawaii Creole English, commonly called Pidgin. It was that generation of not passing it on, she said, referring to colonial bans on the Hawaiian language until the late 20th century. It wasn't until college, when she took a Hawaiian language course, that she said, I fell in love with it and I never stopped. Moana had 1 child in the Hawaiian language preschool and a 19-month-old on the waiting list. Kalani's grandparents also spoke Hawaiian, and he said we would hear it, but we never really spoke it. Like Moana, he got into Hawaiian in college, motivated by his grandmother, who was, quote, hoping that some grandchild would end up learning Hawaiian. 2 of Kalani's 3 children graduated from the school where he taught, and the 4th was a senior there. So we can move to the next slide. Moana and Kalani were well aware of the deficit discourses that learning Hawaiian or any native language would, quote, hold children back from learning English and succeeding in school. And this is what Moana said about that. And the last part of that, of her statement, I think, is especially important. And then, of course, they're surpassing everyone in Hawaiian. Next slide. But Moana and Kalani's aspirations for their students extend far beyond English proficiency. I really want the kids to be a good community contributor, Moana said. Next slide. And to have a strong sense of identity, Kalani added. It'll give them a good understanding of who they are and where they came from, and of course, where they're going to. Well, one thing we've observed and we've been told is that ILI students tend to be more respectful in their demeanor. Is that something you see in your teaching, we asked? There's a spiritual side to our teaching that doesn't get measured when you take exams, Kalani replied. He related this to family bonds that are built into the school culture. Next slide. Family is huge, he said, so we continue that with our teaching. It's not a school anymore, it's family. So they, students, understand their kuleana, their responsibility. You don't want to bring shame to your own family, so it's the same thing here. Next slide. I'm going to return now to the opening story and the conversation that Sheila, Tiffany, and I had with school leader Sarah and community member Ellen. And in the context of that meeting, we asked Sarah about her aspirations for her students. Next slide. I really want to create speakers of our language, she replied. But I also really want people who know who they are. I want these kids to grow up knowing where they came from and be proud of that. Because when kids know who they are, she continued, where they come from, they go out into the world and they're able to accomplish a lot more. They can make changes. She also spoke of wanting students to know how to take care of the earth and respect the environment. So she said, if we're thinking of all these natural elements of the earth, we should also be utilizing them. You don't just thank them every day and then go to McDonald's. You should thank them every day and go to the garden, go to the river, eat the fish, pick the berries, so that you're genuinely thankful for the things that are provided to us. So think about holistic well-being, think about thankfulness and gratitude. Think about nourishing gifts. These are all holistic, significant, and challenging learner outcomes. They're not test items. And it's also important to make visible what Sarah did not include on her list of her aspirations for her students. She never once said it was important for students to pass an English standardized test. Okay, next slide. I'll conclude with a youth perspective, which I've purposefully saved for last. And at the risk of inciting virtual jet lag, but with this worldwide community, perhaps not, we'll cross the continent and the Pacific again and return to the school where Moana and Kalani teach. And this image is of a mural that had been recently painted on one Hawaiian ILI school facility. So it was May 2019, a week before senior graduation, and Sheila and I had the privilege of interviewing 10 high school youth. One was Akoni, a pseudonym, a 16-year-old 10th grader who had an infectious 100-watt smile and carried himself very confidently, spoke thoughtfully and with passion. Well, Akoni's story is a bit different than that of other students we interviewed because he attended English medium public school through grade 5, entering Hawaiian immersion in 6th grade. As he explained, no one really enters after 3rd grade without knowing the language. But he'd been inspired to switch schools when he attended the opening ceremony for a university Hawaiian language program. "Mom, I want to come to this college when I get older," he'd said at the time. "Well, it's easier to learn the language when you're younger," his mother replied. So Akoni wrote to the school principal explaining, quote, "how much I wanted to learn the language and my desire, the love I have for the language. They let me in." He attended a summer language program to prepare for 6th grade. Within a year, he related, "I was able to speak the Hawaiian language, and then I just started getting better and better by reading stories and talking and speaking." Akoni described his mother as Japanese Hawaiian and his father as Irish Italian. His mother's grandfather had discouraged her from learning Hawaiian, quote, "because there's no use for it in today's work." So that tells you a little bit of the story of the Hawaiian language, Akoni reflected, how it was looked down upon in that generation. Next slide. Akoni told us, "I enrolled in this school so I could learn the language, so I'm able to connect with my ancestors, the land, so I could understand what was being said in the chants and the dances, and because I love the language and it's so important for me to revitalize our language." Well, at the time we were there, Akoni and about 10 of his peers had just returned from a trip to the United Nations in New York. This is part of the curriculum too, where they had presented as part of the UN Year of Indigenous Languages. "Yeah, we presented on our school about the language revitalization movement," he said, "the life of the language before and how it died down and then how we got it back great again today and why the language is important to us. So that was a big honor," he said. And we got to talk to lots of different Indigenous people. In one of his research projects, Akoni had discovered a letter written by his maternal great-great-great-grandparents to the family of a revered Hawaiian leader at the time of his passing in 1896. The leader had played a key role in the resistance to the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy by the US government and died shortly after being acquitted and released from federal prison. The letter was written in Hawaiian. "Because of the school," Akoni said, "we were able to find that letter and build that connection." This is very powerful in our view. Okay, we'll turn to the next slide. Toward the end of this amazing interview, we asked Akoni if there was anything he wanted to say to other young people about the education he was receiving. And please listen closely because all of the words that he spoke are not on this slide. But he said, language is the key to the future and being able to bring back knowledge from the past to apply to current problems. Our Hawaiian people, they're entrepreneurs, they're voyagers of the vast sea, they're innovators, they're great agriculture workers, linguists, prophets, seers, observers. All the problems we have today can be solved by reviving the ways and practices our ancestors did. And the only way to revive it is through the language of the ancestors. Well, Akoni is a remarkable young man, but his voice is not alone. All the ILI students and graduates we've been honored to interview share his passion, his desire to reconnect with what many young people refer to as their genealogy, the human and more than human, to quote my UCLA colleague, Dr. Ananda Marin, relations of people and place. I've saved the youth vignette for last because it shines such a clear light on the possibilities of ILI schooling and what we've come to call a relational pedagogy. The youth accounts also remind us of all who build that relational network, parents, teachers, school leaders, and young people. As a form of culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy, and here I'm drawing on my work with Tiffany Lee and Brian Brayboy, and Django Paris and H. Samuel Leem's work on culturally sustaining pedagogy, ILI is a collective effort toward wholeness and well-being. As I mentioned at the beginning, our data collection is unfinished, and we will no doubt be analyzing the data for years to come. I do want to note that although I have not talked much about academic outcomes per se, both the qualitative and the quantitative data indicate that ILI students perform as well or better than non-immersion students on measures of English language arts and mathematics. These are but two outcomes that we are looking at and that are of concern to our partner schools, as you can, I hope, tell from the accounts that I've shared. And of course, as Akoni's account shows, ILI students are learning their ancestral language, gaining cultural knowledge and pride that's just simply not accessible through English. So we believe that ILI offers a pathway to these kinds of possibilities, including our relations with the more than human world, which are increasingly important as we live with the consequences of global climate change. Across all the varied cultural, linguistic, and geographic settings in our study, the themes of relationality, identity, sense of place, belonging, family, and holistic well-being are knitted together through the indigenous language and culture. So I'll conclude with some questions that we're pondering and beginning to write about. What lessons can be learned from ILI for schooling more generally? What might a serious prioritization of relationality and accountability to relationships mean for urban and rural schools, large and small, at different levels of scale? And how might such a focus enable schools to be more responsive, respectful, and engaged with their families and communities? And as our former graduate assistant and now postdoctoral scholar, Dr. Joaquin Noguera asks, what would be required to ensure that all students feel seen, heard, known, understood, cared for, and appreciated? We can go to the last slide now. Again, we see ILI as one pathway toward those possibilities. So I'll end with a final question. How might these values and practices be incorporated into the fabric of education systems in ways that promote sustainable diversity, justice, and young people's self-empowerment? Next slide. Thank you in the multiple languages of our study team.
Thank you so much, Dr. McCarty. Over to you, then Dr. McConey for the first round of questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Teresa, for this very helpful presentation. I've got a couple of issues that I would like you to help me clarify. They fall into three different, the three different types. The first one is on the notion of indigeneity. Then the second one, I want to discuss with you the issues about research methods, framing it using the term that was coined by the African philosopher Pauline Hontonji, extractivist methodologies. Then the third one, I want to frame the conversation using the phrase used by the Portuguese scholar Bonaventura dos Santos, ruined seeds. Okay. Let me concentrate on indigeneity. What your study implicitly raises, I think, is a question of what exactly you understood, or the communities that you dealt with understood by indigeneity. Because you said it's sort of a nationwide study. You went across a number of these different indigenous communities. So my question is, were there any salient differences in how these different groups understood indigeneity to mean? I'll then situate this in another global context.
Yeah, these are great questions, and we could discuss them for at length. Well, I guess the first thing I would say is I'm not sure. I wouldn't want to say that it's understood in a homogeneous way within specific communities.
Okay.
Different people, different parts of communities have different views about that. For example, in Hawaii, the term Native American doesn't always resonate with people, and the term Native Hawaiian also doesn't always resonate, because people who are Hawaiian don't feel that they don't need a qualifier for that. People whose ancestry has been there for millennia. So I'm not sure that there's certainly not an easy answer for that. But I do think that the notion of nation building and sovereignty, and by sovereignty, I don't necessarily mean just or only political sovereignty, but cultural sovereignty. In the Hawaiian language, there's a word, ea, E-A, it's spelled, that refers to sovereignty, but also as Native Hawaiian scholar Noelani Goodyear Ka'opua describes it, also refers to breath, or the very life-giving aspect of breath. So I think this notion of nation building is important across all of our sites, and in the sense of cultural continuance, language being a conduit for that, but linguistic continuance, and the reconnection to across genealogy, 7 generations past and 7 generations forward, that notion. I think I'll stop there.
You stop there. Okay. Then what I find interesting, or the tension that is there is for me, is that there's a part of me that is very sympathetic towards the use of the term indigeneity, for example, scholarly. But there's a part of me that resists the implied purity of that particular, the sense of purity that is implied when you use indigeneity. So what I'm trying to struggle with now is whether in actual fact, I can hold two concepts simultaneously, whether I can think of indigeneity as a form of creolization, meaning that people only become increasingly aware of their sense of indigeneity, particularly in moments when they think they are losing certain things. That prior to that, indigeneity is not significant. But when you think that you are beginning to lose something, then indigeneity becomes a form of consciousness that arises as a strategy of resistance to the feelings of loss. I don't know whether that makes sense. That without feelings of loss, notions of indigeneity are irrelevant, so to speak.
Well, you know,
that's possible. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Certainly, I respect that opinion. The only other thing I would just add is, and this came out in one of the vignettes, is there's also a recognition of, you know, multiple heritage.
Yes.
Akoni's parents, and virtually all the sites, we have people identifying themselves and their students in terms of multiple heritage.
Okay. Yes.
So that's also a factor as well.
That is consistent, I think, with what I was trying to talk about, notions of creolized indigeneity, that you still are indigenous, but it's a blending of different heritages that you are made up of. Okay. Let me then move on to what I thought was the very powerful argument which was running through your presentation, which was what the, in quotes, mainstream scholarship can learn from the indigenous communities. I am very sympathetic towards that particular position, in the sense that my instincts are to say that the experiences of indigenous peoples, the experiences of formerly colonized individuals, can provide and shed insight into some of the major intellectual and social crises that we are facing. That, for example, in your case, by going to the indigenous communities, holistic well-being, etc., that insights from those communities are not only relevant to those communities, they are potentially relevant even to the communities which are not indigenous. In other words, my instinct at the moment is to say the insights that are likely to take us into the future are the ones that come from the previously colonized or so-called indigenous communities. Having said that, though, I'm also fully aware that it's difficult for a previously dominant group to learn from groups of people that they stigmatize. Right. That it's not that the formerly colonized and indigenous communities we don't have anything to learn, but the problem is that for that process to take place, the dominant groups have to unlearn their own prejudices against us, right? That you have to learn that, oh, you can, but before you learn from people that you stigmatizes, you have to unlearn your own prejudices. And that, I think, is the challenge that mainstream scholarship is faced with. How to unlearn so that they can set in motion a process in which they can learn from the groups of people who are on the margins of the whole society that they're dealing with. I don't know whether it makes sense to you, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, this is, in some ways, I think of this as the tension that, you know, I've been wrestling with in my whole professional career, which is, has been, you know, working with schools and how can you take these state assimilation machines and repurpose them for something very, very different. So, I mean, you definitely have, you know, you put your finger on the pulse of the core or a core tension in all of this work. I guess my response to that, again, looking at how those kinds of tensions play out in the context of school, is these people are doing it. It's just amazing, inspiring work, and it's a life commitment. There's no question about it. So just for example, take the two teachers that I described, and it's a multi-generational kind of commitment. The teachers who had their children graduated from the school where they taught. They had them on waiting lists to get into the school where they were teaching. And very often the students who graduate go on to become teachers and come back to the very schools or other schools like that where they teach. So my answer is, I guess we have to take a long view on what you're describing there. And we also have to take hope, I think, in the work of people like these who are repurposing institutions of coloniality for indigenous self-determined purposes and goals.
Then let me move to something that you talked about briefly, and then I'll give over to Rafael, and then we can always continue the conversation. Is the issue of assessment. Over the years, when I read and followed your work, what I've always found, what I've always tried to grapple with, I like your work. And there's one paper that you wrote, I think, sometime way back in the 90s or so, where you talk about assessment in these indigenous schools or something like that. So I was always intrigued by how you are able to resolve the tension of talking about assessment and then still be able to put forward the arguments about holistic learning, etc. Right? That is the thing that I've always found very interesting and sort of I've struggled to try and get hold of, because I guess my supervisor was into language testing, but a very different type of language testing from you. But I was always interested in how you are able to talk about language testing in this particular universe that you work in.
Yeah, you're asking a whole lot of real easy questions. Can you give me a hardball? Yeah. Well, so in our study, we are interested in holistic, we're interested in looking at holistic outcomes and the outcomes as that the people who are doing this work want for their children, for their communities, for their families, for themselves. So we are taking a broad view of assessment.
Okay.
I will say, though, that the quantitative data that we're also collecting, and my colleague, Dr. Michael Seltzer, is leading our quantitative, the quantitative part of our team, is very much, I think, desired by most of the kinds of findings. What we are finding, that, as I said, that students are not, quote, losing out or lagging behind or something because they're in an Indigenous language immersion program, because it's a policy, it's a tool to help affect policy, and policy is all about power, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Even though it is such a amazing mechanism for veiling its own power. So those kinds of things, and those things are also important to a lot of parents. You know, they want their kids to do. They want their kids to be able to do well, to to have multiple options and things like that. So I guess my response is, the way that I personally have dealt with that, and as a scholar in this field, is to just be attentive to the desires and the wishes of the communities and the people that we work with. And even as we're trying to change the system, using the tools of power to be able to do some of that. And assessment on the kinds of things that state departments and school districts assess students on are some of those tools. One of the school leaders at a site that we work has talked about this as keeping this is during the No Child Left Behind in the United States days, keeping the No Child Left Behind wolves at bay so we can do the work that we want to do. I should ask you that question, though.
Oh yeah, you can ask me. You can ask me. Okay, what do I think about assessment? This is what I think. I think you can use assessment in some cases to initiate social and institutional change. I think I'm talking about washback effects here. That in those contexts, for example, in which there's a preoccupation with passing exams and all things like that, the way to change how the learning takes place, I would argue, is you change the exam. You change the format the exams will take place. So if we want to emphasize that they should learn in this way or they should learn in that way, your easiest way into changing an institutional system is to change the way the tests are constructed. That is how I see it. In other words, I think the preoccupation with test and assessment by students is potentially a good thing if you turn it completely on its head. Right. They are preoccupied. Then if you then decide that this is the way the learning should go ahead, and if the students are preoccupied with testing, you turn everything completely upside down and you design the test in a different way. And if they are preoccupied with testing, then they're going to learn in a different way. And then the second thing I think that I'm interested in, which is part of the conversation with you, which I wanted to ask, are there any assessment tools, etc., tests that you are aware of in these indigenous communities that the communities have designed for themselves to evaluate their own students? Let's say if the indigenous communities, Cherokee or whatever, are there any assessments that they'll say, oh, these are our tests. This is how we evaluate people in order to see whether you are able to do A, B, C, or D? Do they have endogenously constructed assessment instruments that they've created for themselves?
Well, certainly there are language, tests in the languages that are being assessments that in the languages that are being taught in the various communities that have been developed generally locally. The state of Hawaii recently implemented a whole Hawaiian assessment for students that are in the Hawaiian immersion schools, and that had a lot of my understanding is that had a lot of support from people that are actually doing this kind of education.
Okay.
There's also been resistance, boycotts of state-sponsored testing. How can you test kids in English when they're getting their education in a different language?
Yes.
And then there are, I think, some of the curricular, some experiences that children in these programs are getting they're not testable in that sense of paper and pencil or whatever kinds of tests, but there's sort of tests of survival, of being able to do things, of taking care of the land, of being able to do the ceremonies, those kinds of things, those real life activities, and that is what cultural continuance is all about, is being able to actually do that. There's a wonderful video by the Akwesasne Freedom School that came out, and I think Akwesasne TV put it out in December, and that school has been in existence since I don't know, they just had their 40th year. And they talk about the graduates of those schools are able to perform the ceremonies. They don't need the elders anymore, although the elders are, of course, always invited and participate. But they now have, their graduates can perform the longhouse ceremonies. They can do all kinds of other leadership roles in the community to carry the community forward. So those are the kinds of outcomes that are often the most important outcomes for communities too. And I will say there are schools in our study who just do not subscribe to any form of standardized testing.
Yeah, but what I meant was, even if the testing is non-standardized, how do they determine within those indigenous communities that you are now able to carry out a particular task? Yes. What criteria do they use to make that particular determination? But anyway, let me leave it there and then give this to Mark. I'll come back to talk about issues about extractivist scholarship, because I'm particularly intrigued to know how these different indigenous communities respond to your scholarship and the publications when they read them. For example, if you were to give them or discuss the results from your study, how do they respond to this particular interpretation of their social and ethnographic life? But let's leave that for the time being to give other people a chance to talk. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Makoni, for initiating this very stimulating discussion. And it's an honor for me to be chairing this Q&A session, which should last around 30 minutes. So if you'd like to participate more actively, please feel free to use the chat function to write the comment or question, and I can read it for you. Or if you'd rather make your intervention yourself, just let me know either by raising your hand using the reactions button or just write it in the chat, and I'll let you know when it's your turn. I will start by reading a comment by Rosalind Howard, which connects to one of the last points made by Makoni. And Rosalind writes, "Hi everyone. Thanks, Teresa, for your very thought-provoking presentation. About Makoni's question regarding own ways of testing, the work of Abadio Green with indigenous students in Colombia is relevant. See his Pedagogía de la Madre Tierra program, Pedagogy of the Mother Earth. The students use multiple media to present the findings of their research projects." Thank you, Rosalind, for the reference.
Thank you, Rosaline. It's good to see you in the group. And I will look that up. That's great.
I will then move on to ask a question that Magda wrote in the chat. I wish to learn more about the meaning of social justice within ILI, comparing to social justice as in BLM or to social justice initiatives to decolonize K-12 curriculum. In other words, would social justice meaning change depending on the locus of enunciation?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I have a pat. I'm sure I don't have a pat answer for that. I think in this context, it has a lot to do with repatriation or rematriation, and reparation and healing and sovereignty and what that actually means. There's a wonderful article by Aleut scholar Dr. Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. It's called "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," where they talk about, I suppose we could call it social justice, but they talk about what's real with regard to indigenous peoples and Native American peoples in particular, when we're talking about decolonization. And that so to say decolonizing schools or decolonizing curriculum in some ways shortchanges, and that's probably a euphemism to put it that way, what decolonization is all about. And that has to do, in the case of Native people, with land, waters, and sovereignty in multiple forms. So yeah, I think it's a very complicated issue, and it's perhaps different in these contexts than in other contexts because of the history of coloniality.
Thank you. I'll move on then to read what Bonnie Norton wrote. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Teresa. What do you see as the distinction between relational pedagogy and culturally responsive pedagogy?
Thank you, Bonnie. That's if I may, and it's good to see you too in the room, all of these, everyone. I think, well, okay, that's a real good question. I think a relational pedagogy is probably part and parcel of a culturally responsive pedagogy. And as you might know, Tiffany Lee and I have come to call this culturally sustaining and revitalizing pedagogy, because in these contexts, you can't really talk about doing this without having that revitalization or reclamation component to the work. What we're seeing as we look at what that looks like on the ground in the schools that we've been privileged to be able to work with, is this really strong core value and practice of relationality. So I would say that it's part of what makes a pedagogy culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, culturally revitalizing. It's a core element of that. It's not the only element, but it's definitely a core element.
Thank you. I see that Desmond has raised his hand. So Desmond, please.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you, everyone. I'd like to just drop a pebble right behind Simfrey's earlier comment about the meaning of indigenous in the work you're doing. And I do this because I've wrestled with the same question that Simfrey was articulating. That is the question of thinking of the indigenous as a static thing, something that is sealed, and also in some ways something that belongs to the past.
Mm.
Now, there are two specific contexts in which I have encountered these framings of the indigenous. One of them, through my own scholarship, has been just in engaging with questions of modernity, a forward-looking modernity that locates the indigenous in the past. And whenever you encountered someone who was attempting to reconnect with their own indigenous identities or to indigenous identities elsewhere, the question always is, why are you trying to recover something from the past as if it is frozen in time and space? Why not focus on the present and moving forward? Because the thing we consider to be indigenous is fundamentally flawed from that perspective. It's not static and so forth. So we cannot find a time and place specific enough to pin the ideas or the origins of indigenous. The second context out of which I engaged this has been, in religion in the African context, where Christianity has taken such deep roots that it's become a political force of its own, sometimes used to deadly ends. And whenever people attempted to reconnect with their indigenous realities, the question, it's always been, the reaction has always been one of trying to force them away from paganism. Paganism that is considered a synonym for evil or Satanism and so forth. Now, the way I've tried to resolve these challenges with myself is that, and I think I comment on this in one of my contributions actually to Simfrey's recent work, is that this attack on the indigenous, or this fear about the indigenous being constructed as static, seem to reflect a hypersensitivity that is visited on notions of the indigenous in a way that is not visited on anything else, especially the thing that we call modernity. In my philosophy of education class, for instance, I teach all the way from Plato coming forward in Western thought. There are many people who are as religious in their engagement with Kant or with Plato than our ancestors, than our people, than the people who are sensitive to the indigenous are attach themselves to particular practices in the indigenous world. So I think when we think of Europe, for instance, to be to use a geopolitical reference, we don't raise that level of sensitivity about status when thinking about Europe's past. People who existed in Europe thousands of years ago are still revered today as relevant to modern thought. But in indigenous societies, whenever you try to reference those same realities, then that hypersensitivity surges to the front. So my sense is that there is at the foundation of the concern about whether the indigenous is static or not is really Eurocentricity surging forth to try to define itself as the only legitimate tool or frame for accepting whatever is indigenous or not. That is, anything that is Eurocentric is valid. It doesn't matter how long ago that thing might have existed. But if it's outside the Eurocentric frame, then it should be rejected because it belongs to the past, or it is not indigenous enough, and so forth. So I've found that the concern simply was risen. I think I've resolved it for myself. It's no longer something I worry about. I think the framing of those conversations as something belonging to the past, the present, or the future can be distracting. I think I tend to focus on the ever present because there is an aggregation of both the past and the future in the present, in the only reality that we live, that is the present reality. And I think every body of knowledge is in a flux. Every practice is constantly changing, or like Simfrey says, creolized in that sense. I would treat all of them as equally creolized, wherever they are found. But thank you again for these wonderful thoughts.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful.
Thank you. I see now that Ellen Cushman has raised the hand. Please, Ellen.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk today. I've long admired your work and followed it, and very much appreciate everything that you're attempting to do with studying ILI programs. That's very, very important and hugely helpful to all of us. So much appreciation for your work. I'd like to go back, if we could, to something that was listed in one of your slides as, I think it was listed as one of the last kind of ways in which you were talking about this, but I heard you mention it as well, as this idea of spirituality and how across the ILI communities, spirituality and spirituality seems to be perhaps even enacted in the language. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. And I'd like to share just one quote with you, if I may, from one of my own language teachers, Benny Smith, who in talking about Cherokee and saying why it is important to speak in Cherokee is, he says, "I will teach you about prayer. Where is God? God is a passenger stowed away in your breath. And every time you speak an Indigenous word, a Cherokee word, you are actually enacting that spirituality in a community of practice. And so the spirituality becomes part of your civic and part of your sovereignty and part of your community." One more story, if I may. My language teacher just the other day talked about the ways in which in Cherokee, the understanding is that we begin with the spirituality first and learning everything, spirituality first, and then the body, and then the mind. And this is how we place ourselves in a learning situation. And he compared that to English, which begins by first and foremost bodily needs, and then thinking about the mind and educating the mind, and then perhaps spirituality. And that spirituality is something that becomes much more of an intellectual exercise, perhaps, which seems to resonate with Desmond, if I may call you Desmond, your last comment in the ways in which spirituality becomes its own framing, its own driving force, oftentimes with colonial and imperial exigence behind it. And so I'm wondering if we could go back to this idea of spirituality, and you could talk a little bit more about how it is people in these communities understood spirituality in relation to language.
Okay, that's a very, very deep and multifaceted question. Thank you for sharing some of your own experiences and work with that. So in one of the slides that, one of the vignettes that I shared, there's the teacher who we call Kalani, talks about that notion of spirituality and relates that to family and to genealogy, past, present, and future. And all of that is carried through the language. There's a spiritual dimension to all of this, a sort of a reverence that is tied up with being able to be a full participant in the language, in cultural activities and cultural practices. I'm probably not the best person to be able to answer your question. I really think that that's something that is inherent in each of these in the communities, but is also, you know, it's not homogeneous within the communities. But the idea of being able to take care of things like ceremony and to be able to do that properly in the language, that is an important value and cultural practice that's tied up with spirituality. Being able to talk about and with ancestors, and to be able to do that properly and respectfully by doing it in the language is important, and that's a facet of spirituality. You know, people talk about when they pass and being able to talk to Creator properly and respectfully in the language. All of those values and those practices and those beliefs are part of what we see being enacted and taught in these programs that we're able to work with. Maybe that touches a little bit on your question, and
It does. Thank you. I was hoping you would scan across the sites and talk a little bit more about that. It does. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then up next, we have a question by Mari Haneda, which is a follow-up question to Bonnie Norton's question. And Mari writes, can you explain your use of culturally sustaining pedagogy? Is the use of the term the same as Paris and Alim, e.g. youth creating new cultural practices?
So I think we do definitely, thank you for that. Thank you very much for that question. And we definitely do draw on Django Paris and Sami Alim's important work in this area. And as originally articulated by Django Paris in his 2012 article, an education researcher, he uses this notion of sustaining as having a more sort of a vital, dynamic quality to it than in his words, you know, being culturally responsive. That is actually doing something to sustain cultural practices was how I understand his use of that. And what Tiffany Lee and I in an invited paper by Django Paris and Sami Alim tried to do is place that in the context of the indigenous communities that we know and that in Tiffany's case she lives in and that we work with, where there is this history of coloniality. So in our usage, we emphasize decolonization, right? Anti-colonialism has to be part of that practice, critically engaging with colonization and its contemporary manifestations, not as well as its history, and the need to reclaim and revitalize and to use that critical consciousness, that critical education as a pivoting point for reclamation and revitalization. So I think what we're trying to do is to build on what Paris and Alim have put forward, that important work, and to contextualize that within the indigenous communities that we know and that we work with.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, again, for that question.
And Bonnie Norton.
Good to see everybody here. You can see it's still dark outside in Vancouver. I was up at 5 o'clock this morning, Teresa. So what a pleasure to be here. I decided I better ask this question because it's quite a complex question, difficult to write in the chat. I mean, technology is interesting because what can you actually communicate in a chat? It's often much more nuanced than you're able to articulate. So and this is the question of children who are not successful necessarily in learning the Indigenous language or struggle to learn the language. Do they feel in your research that somehow they're indigenate, they have betrayed their Indigenous identities, or they feel that they're not adequately Indigenous because they haven't learned the language, perhaps as others have, or have perhaps not been as successful? It's a complex question, but it's that whole connection between, competence, so to speak, in a language and, Indigenous identity and the sense of claiming, an Indigenous identity. As I say, it's it's a complex question. So I hope you understand the spirit of that. How do we work, how do we work with those students, or how do we maybe even reframe the questions or what it means to be Indigenous? In other words, indigeneity includes, but is obviously not exclusive to knowledge of the language or level of competence in the language. Right? It's a complex question. I wonder if you can help me with that. Help others as well.
I think you're muted, Teresa. Sorry.
Thank you
There
for
we
that,
go.
Bonnie. I said it would be great to also hear from others on this. Yes, of course. And this is all part of the coloniality of this, of all of this that contextualizes a lot of this work, and the decoloniality, the need to decolonize, and the efforts to decolonize also contextualize this work. Because where do those kinds of feelings, of beliefs, ideologies, where do those come from? And actually, Django Paris and Samuel Leem talk about this as sort of the inward gaze and being able to, in our pedagogy, to be able to help learners, help students kind of take that critical perspective on where those kinds of internalized beliefs come from. Be critical about that. So, and we do hear, young people who say, I'm not native if I can't speak the language. All of that is part of this saturation of coloniality and English and white supremacy. So that's part of the task, I guess, in the kind of education that we have to do. And maybe this goes back a little bit to, the question about social justice and what does social justice look like in the context of this kind of work. I imagine there are others in our group here who have some important ideas about this.
Thank you. Just to say, Teresa, I think you make the important point that is part of the task, isn't it? Mm. Actually, that is what you have to grapple with. Mm-hmm. It's something that, it is part of the challenge of doing this kind of work. And I guess working with the communities in meaningful ways. But I see there are other people who put up their hands. Perhaps they can help. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have Mokulu Saxena and then Desmond Odugu. You're still muted, sorry. Thank you.
Sorry, I was munching away my lunch in the UK. So we're just completing the climb from the west to the east, I think, people being in different places. And I think that's where I'm locating my question. And I think to carry on from what Bonnie asked, I think she said, what do the young people think? And I think my question is, on whose behalf are we doing this work? And the reason I ask is, I've been doing this kind of work for a very long time. In the 80s, early 80s, I worked among the tribal people in India. At that time, that's what they were called, about the development of literacies, or literacy at that time. And then I worked in the UK among the minorities, and then I worked in Brunei, China, and different places. So there's a kind of a climb in terms of coloniality, is that we're locating people in different climes, that even if, like in Brunei, I worked among the majority people, Malays, right? And when I worked in the West, among the minorities, as opposed to in the East, where I have looked at the question of English in relation to the local languages, whereas here in the UK, I have looked at the question of minority languages in relation to English. It's just the other way around. Okay, and in that multilingual sort of mesh, all these issues come up at different levels. So, and one of the things that I was trying to grapple with in the 80s when I was working with the minorities language, and the work was on language maintenance shift. And at that time, my question was, what was that community that I was talking about? And I found that within a small community, Punjabi Hindus, Punjabis are, sort of all kinds of religious and ethnic groups are, and religious groups are involved in that, but they're termed as Punjabis. Within a very small group of Punjabi Hindus, I found so many differences. And within that, you have age differences and so on. So I'm just coming back to Bonnie's point, the different people had different take on what they consider to be indigenous, what they consider to be their history, what they consider to be their, so they were gatekeepers, okay? Okay, they're like community people, those who were the politicians, okay? But for some locals, they were seen as suppressors, okay? They were doing their politics. On the other hand, younger people are saying that, why are we asked to do things that these people, they want to contain us. They don't allow change. So it's a very big problem for me to understand on whose behalf are we working? Are these younger people, the gatekeepers, or we are coming from outside from critical perspective that we think these things needs to be done? Because I've seen problems with terms when we sort of poke into the communities and divide them, categorize them, this one or that one, you could have very, very big problems in countries. So I have seen that within the communities. So this is a bigger question for me, and that I'm trying to understand. And none of them is wrong. And let me not, sort of see it. It's just grappling with that, on whose behalf, we have different perspectives. Yes, we are working for critical perspective, but on whose behalf are we working? Whose agenda are we promoting? So, and I think with your work, you have been, doing this kind of work for a long time, how would you sort of reflect on that?
Yeah. Well, that's a very, very good example and question. So, and I think this is part of being critically reflexive in our practice as, quote, researchers, people going into these communities, working with these communities. And I guess on whose behalf also then begs the question, who benefits, right? And to me, that is kind of the abiding question that's always not in the back of the mind, but the front of the mind. Who benefits, in what ways, who might be damaged, what might be damaged, and just to have as part of our habit of mind and a way of being a researcher, I've called it in some of my writing, to keep those questions paramount.
That's very helpful. Just taking it further, for me, in addition to that, there is a question of what kind of research questions we ask. So it's not simply about being having a reflective practice, but what kind of research questions are we asking
Exactly.
Which, yeah,
That's it, exactly. And yeah, and who benefits from asking those questions? Where do they come from? Where, you know, what kind, the answers, who will benefit from answering those questions? Absolutely. It goes down to the very questions we ask. Thank you. That's for reminding us of that.
Thank you. I see that we're reaching the end of our 90-minute session, and there are still 2 interventions there from Desmond and from Adrian. So what I propose is that Makoni now rounds up the discussion, engaging with the comments made by the participants and the responses given by Teresa. And then if Desmond and Adrian are okay with it, they present their thoughts in the after party. Great, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Teresa and everybody. What I'm going to try and do now is to see if I can connect the conversation we are having now with the conversation that we had last week, and see whether we can move the conversation one step forward. And the overlap in the conversations we had last week and the conversations we had this week began to emerge when we kept coming back to the discussions about coloniality and decoloniality, for example. I would like to begin with a quotation from a Southeast Asian scholar who simply says, a straightforward definition of the decolonial project is impossible. And then the argument then goes on to say, even though this is impossible, there are forms of exploitation, marginalization, dispossession, and silencing that need to be addressed by uncovering erasures and telling stories of people who have been marginalized, silenced, and dehumanized, according to decolonial thinkers. Decolonial scholarship should therefore involve dialogue with many communities across the globe, because decoloniality is a global project. For example, African applied linguistics engaging in dialogue, not only with applied linguists in the global north, but in the global south or in the post-socialist world. Then another aspect that is linked to this is that decolonial scholarship is not a part-time project. You don't say, I'm doing it now, and then tomorrow you don't do it, etc. It is something that cuts across everything that you do. The other part that is related to what we've been talking about is the one that then frames decoloniality as bringing new ways of thinking, living, and being into perspective. Yet this means not only analyzing new languages or the use of language in new contexts, but also novel ways of analyzing language, which resist the intellectual burden and the pull of Western linguistics, and advocates other frames of analytical thinking that have not yet been popularized in linguistics, such as wet ontologies, liquid materiality, and using pipes and plumbing rainwater and water pipes as analytic heuristics. Even though as I reflect on this, even though the term decolonization is widely used, particularly as a rallying cry across many domains and disciplines, and for example, we have been using it quite a lot in these sessions, we need to be extremely careful in our use of the concept of decoloniality, because a conceptual vocabulary about decoloniality is still information and unsure of its mark. Temporality is a key conflicting time frame out of sync, and there's a jostling between longer and short durays. By enumerating the various processes through which decolonization may be carried out, we are trying to preempt the critique that decolonization is a type of political correctness, a form of academic fashion, which may preempt serious and sustained practical intellectual labor. Decolonial thinkers must, from this point of view, to quote Gordon, go beyond decoloniality for the sake of decoloniality. If decolonization is to be effective, we need to be conceptually clear what decolonization is for. For example, Frantz Fanon and Cabral were clear conceptually and politically what decolonization would look like, and carefully articulated what decolonization was for. In linguistics, we argue that decolonization entails reducing the Western hold of academy on how languages across the globe are analyzed, as well as the tendency to feed analysis of non-Western languages into a taxonomy which originally meant for Western languages. In uncritical acceptance and the endorsement of validity of the notion, I would argue, of language itself may be a subtle imprint of colonialism, even in decolonial scholarship. And the interesting paradox about decolonial scholarship, whether it's sociolinguistics, education, etc., is as follows. Decolonial scholarship seeks teleologically to suspend disciplinarity. So you cannot decolonize sociolinguistics and still expect to produce sociolinguistics, because the aim of decolonial scholarship is to suspend the idea of the discipline that you are dealing with. The consideration of self-transcending decoloniality, which Gordon proposes, raises an important problem of what follows when decoloniality becomes an objective as opposed to a means. Without carefully reflecting on what decoloniality represents, it becomes a slogan which appeals to elusive notions of purity. The need to go beyond decoloniality, or to quote Gordon again, to transcend decoloniality, means being able to clearly articulate and depict the nature of the world we are aspiring. For example, if the goal is to decolonize applied linguistics, it is necessary to describe the nature of the applied linguistics that we expect to emerge after that applied linguistics has been decolonized, as we seek to do here. We are arguing, I think, in these conversations, that a decolonial applied linguistics, for me, for example, should decenter humans and language in its analytical apparatus. Thanks, Rafa. You can go back to Desmond, then we've got Adrian, then we've got Marilyn Martin-Jones, and then Teresa, then we keep moving on. Then the conversation moves on.
Simfrey, I feel like I need a few hours just to digest what you were just commenting on. So I thank you for that. And my comment is intended to follow. I think it was Bonnie Norton's question about the impact on people's identity as indigenous people if they cannot learn the language, for instance. I think that in many ways, Buko's question further elaborates the thoughts that's been forming for me. And I'd like to approach this along two lines that I think, again, points to how I've been engaging with this subject. So earlier, my earlier comment noted that one of the ways this question has arose to me was the engagement of Christian practices in African contexts with people who, surprisingly, up until 2021, still identify with the indigenous. As a matter of fact, there is a symposium organized recently, I think this is happening in a week or two, that is intended to engage with the problem and seek solutions to a phenomenon of young people returning to paganism. This is the way that the symposium is framed. And they see this as a very serious problem, and they're asking, how do we solve this? A lot of the panelists are religious people, so priests and pastors and so forth. Now, the ways that I've seen many important and people I respect in the African context, but important religious thinkers engage with that subject is to frame the indigenous as fluid. That is to say, and I've heard someone say that our ancestors, our cultural ancestors, were a lot more flexible. They were a lot more open to accepting and engaging with other knowledge traditions. That's why they accepted Christianity. That those who are seeking to return to the indigenous are trying to hold on to an ossified past that never existed as such. So that is one of the ways that I see that. And I think there's a second piece to this. That is that these individuals are also framing the indigenous past as good, as essentially good and unproblematic. And they often point to, twin killings and all kinds of things as indications of the barbarity of the indigenous that people were wise to walk away from, and now the current generation are trying to return to. It's almost like, do you really know what you're trying to go back to? Why not follow Christianity because it's the purer religion and so on and so forth? Now, I do sympathize with the question that the indigenous is not pure. Mm-hmm. I also do agree that the indigenous is not all good. Mm-hmm. I think my challenge is that same logic does not get applied to other traditions, especially those of the West. For instance, the same Christian thinker who's making this comment about African traditional or indigenous religious experiences do not engage with the history of Christianity in murder and in killing people, for instance. They do not engage with the history of Christianity in creating some of the traumas, especially, for instance, in North America, that we've come to know today as transatlantic slavery. That is the ways that different people have used Christian ideas to perpetrate all kinds of violence. So we are somewhat able to extract what is good out of Christianity and sort of ignore the other darker sides, but we don't see the possibility of young people today doing exactly the same things with their African traditional religious experiences. That is, looking past the errors or what they see as errors in those traditions and extracting something that might be positive out of it. I think the other place I see this is, for instance, an engagement with the nation state. Many people have come to accept the nation state and the swath of economic, political, cultural, and even social arrangements of human experiences that it takes control of as a good thing, as a benign process. I think there are, it's mostly in the academia that I see people engage with the nation state from a very problematic place. Otherwise, elsewhere, I see people look to the nation state to solve its problems, including questions or problems of social justice. Sometimes those appeals are made to the nation state coalescing at the international level. Those appeals to the international community and so forth, which is nothing but a conglomeration of nation state governments. And again, I don't know that the nation state was formed to be a benign institution worldwide. I think the institution, the political institution of the nation state has been used as a tool for social control. And it is possible to find in many places expressions, the political expressions of the nation state used for positive ends, for people to use that to try to help people. But I don't think that that same logic is applied to the indigenous world. I think whenever people say you can't go back to the indigenous because it was bad or it was not static, a lot of things that we do today have never been static. I think the indigenous world was more flexible, truly, but so was everywhere. To Nicole's question, for instance, I don't know why we don't engage with the idea that English itself is an indigenous language. The English people are indigenous people. They might have lost them. People of European descent in the Americas are indigenous people. They might have lost their way. They might have lost contact with their indigeneity, but they are no less indigenous than an African person who moves to the US, has children, and their people don't know their way back home anymore. There is something fundamentally indigenous about being human, and I think that's what's missing in that conversation. So my hope is that the question about in whose interest we are asking these questions goes deeper to engage with the exact question that created the identity of indigenous as this is separate and exotic that can be viewed only from a distance. Because that's the problem. That is thinking that the indigenous is that thing over there, not us. We all are indigenous and should stop, in my view, at least I've stopped questioning how people characterize the indigenous or not. I mean, I think I'm busier now trying to find my way in rethinking how I came to be where I am and what resources that one can tap, including from my own traditional Igbo indigenous world, that will be helpful in living a meaningful relational life that doesn't just support me, but try to support others and live well with our environment. I think that's a healthier practice for me than trying to essentialize anyone or anything. But thank you again for all these amazing thoughts.
Right. Rafula is still there or what? Adrian, you wanted to raise a question.
Thank you very much, my brother. It's very interesting. I came to understand that some of the beautiful words or concepts for Professor McCarty are epistemology and ontology. And I find it very, very interesting. And again, I thank my brother, Brother Desmond. I did my philosophy master's work on a thesis on the work of John Samuel Mbiti, the African theologian and philosopher from Kenya. And I did study his concept of being human, whose concept I did compare to the German theologian concept of being man, of being human. And quite interesting. And what I want to say here is that some of the questions that my brother has raised, those are very, very important questions that have been intrinsic in just the history of African theological and philosophical discourses for the last 40 or 50 years. And they're very, very important. What is there in African traditional system that we can take? And just as you know, that even one can go back to the time of negritude, just what our big brothers or our just predecessors did is really to respond to those myths, just Western myths that that Africa had nothing to give. And that's very, very, very important. And again, Professor McCarty, thank you very much, because you stress very often the idea of decolonization being a process, and again, a political discourse. And that's very, very, very important. Just some of the current theorists of decolonization in the African context, people like Achille Mbembe, who is from Cameroon, as you know, has been given a serious work by the current French president, Macron, to engage the African youth, to reflect on the relational dynamics between France and Africa. And I know that brother Achille Mbembe is in trouble now. I just thought that he has been corrupted by the French government, so on. And that's very important. But what is so important that Achille Mbembe spent sometimes in my country, the Congo, just on the side of Congo River, seeing how beautiful the Congo River is and seeing the misery in which the Congolese are. And when he saw that, we came to realize that no, this discourse, so this just concept of decolonization is nothing else but a process and just a process and a political discourse. Very, very important. Today's conference has webinar taught me a lot in terms of knowledge or systems of thoughts. Knowledge, system of thoughts, the one and the many. And in England, as you know, Professor McCarty, mainly in Birmingham, we had the called father of multiculturalism, Professor Stuart Hall, and whose work, of course, you know. And here I'm thinking about the challenge in the classroom just many in the West. And myself, I did much work among refugees communities, many Francophone, whether in England, where I lived for more than 12 years, and here in America, just my work among refugees communities and so on, and the challenges in the classroom. And again, reading people like Fanon, just many Paulo Freire, just with his concept of critical pedagogy. And one just in relation to today's talk, just wants to understand what kind of pedagogic approaches that can be just really developed in that natural just setting in places like London, Washington, D.C., here in America, where you've got those many refugees, children coming from Congo, and just from Goma, from Ethiopia, and so on. And just those political just predicaments brought them here. But again, when they come here, they are exposed to just the modernity and so on. And here you've got the teacher in the classroom is facing some challenges, not only in terms of language, but again, that Weltanschauung, worldview, just and so on, the predicament of the teacher. And that's what I want you to know, whether really the relational pedagogy is quasi different from Paulo Freire's concept of critical pedagogy. And those are the questions that I wanted to know.
Okay.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
thank you very much, my brother. Teresa or Marie Hanida, do you want to respond? Is there a difference between Paul Freire's notions of pedagogy and relational pedagogy?
Well, I don't know if there's a difference. I think there's probably a complementarity.
Okay.
I mean, yes, I think I would put it that way. And you know, Freire's whole emphasis on reading the world as well as the word, and that there's a decolonial implication in that, in his pedagogy and in his philosophy. So I would see them as complementary. When I think of relational pedagogy, I think of things like mutuality, reciprocity, accountability to relationships, responsibility, those kinds of things. So I think those would be complementary.
Okay, good. Right. Any more questions? If not, we can thank Teresa. But before we do that, Kim, can you give us an idea of who is coming next?